Hello, in this video I want to continue talking about some of the stuff that I talked about in the last video in terms of discussing going for Baudrillard on the negative versus critical teams. In a lot of these videos I kind of been talking about some of the concepts that are really potent in various forms of Baudrillard's writing about representation and the relationship that other authors have taken and interpreting that in the context of the university. And so a lot of this stuff has really been about talking about the relationship that a lot of these arguments draw between form and content in order to make like really strong arguments that like move out of the kind of like specific stuff that the 1AC is offering as like a type of like pedagogy or way of thinking about or understanding subject information. It is more to draw on like uniqueness and limitation barriers that exist in relationship to the criticism's ability to like actually create or manifest itself in a way that it like actually materializes for the communities that it's attempting to represent. And so this video is meant to kind of like use some of those types of arguments and see how they could be applied to various arguments across the flow in order to make really compelling offense in places that I think really make sense. I think that this is an argument that a lot of teams really shy away from against Unique teams, because I think that there are a lot of like interesting critiques of the way that Baudrillard writes about like different forms of suffering and the way that we represent suffering. But I also think there are like really interesting interpretations of like how Baudrillard is writing about this and the way that is spoken about in the context of the academia, that I think that this is going to be something that you can really dive into as you kind of understand like where the places that you need to focus and how you apply things like the framing, the thesis that I talked about in the last video to the one here. And so hopefully if you didn't watch the last one, you watch it now in order to get context for some of the stuff that I'll be talking about now. To kind of start this video, I want to start talking about the link portion of the debate. I think that when you're thinking about the link portion of the debate on how you should read this against various K teams, obviously like I say in all videos, it's going to be something where a lot of these really change depending on what team you're really reading against. And I think that that can kind of make it a little bit overwhelming at first, but I also think there are a lot of like central arguments that you're really trying to make in terms of what types of methodology the 1AC takes up that really gives you a lot of ground to critique the 1AC on. So for instance, I think that even if you don't have particular arguments for like every single type of critical affirmative can be read, I think just being able to make basic arguments about why, for instance, using images of suffering to like justify how we like enact ourselves politically is like a bad source of how we like think about politics. So like why the idea that creating a like new way of thinking about things or studying things within the university directly translates to radical change actually kind of like mystifies how the university is like motivated or tied up in like capitalism and how it is like meant to be an institution that is it within the production of like signs and signifiers, etc. These types of arguments that really talk about the various limitations that set like top level boundaries for any type of affirmative just work as like base level places for you to work off and then create specific offense. And I think it's really just a question of how you take then filling in some of the places where the 1AC does get specific on why its particular way of thinking about the world is useful, and taking that in order to think about like ways you can apply that to some of the top level theories that you're thinking about and some of the basic ideas that you might have for like a type of methodology that the 1AC is taking up, and start creating link arguments that really like situationally and are like really example specific, but use a lot of the language that you're kind of already comfortable with at the top, even if you aren't like completely 100% sure on how the every part of the criticism is kind of like fitting together. And so I think when you're on the negative reading this argument, it's particularly important to like try to like take these top level arguments and not leave them just at this like top level general uniqueness argument, because they're going to make arguments about like all of these things are kind of inevitable and why there isn't like a safe space for a lot of the type of knowledge that is being produced, and why there is kind of like value to certain things that happen in debate. And I think that there are compelling examples on both sides of how debate translates into politics, but I think that you would be much better situated really fixing this in the context of what the 1AC does specifically, because the more specific you get in making your language adapt to the 1AC, the less it makes sense for them to be able to grasp for examples that aren't really in the context of what their aff does, which really limits the field in the question of like how they're both winning that their method is like different from the status quo, and winning that it like takes up things that have already been happening in the present and in the past. I think in the relationship to the permutation, this is a place where I think that it really flows with the uniqueness debate and really flows with your ability to control the uniqueness debate. I think if you're winning that all these things are legitimate barriers, and that like reading this with maybe like a refusal alternative can really give you the basis to have a strong answer against the permutation. And I generally think that it's a place where I wouldn't really worry too much as long as you're like winning some of the other places on the argumentation. But I think that places that you can really be scared about here are just like really tricky permutations that come from critical affirmatives that really bend their method to try to be as inclusive or as close as possible to your alternative without kind of like sticking to some of the stuff in the 1AC. I think that you can kind of like be able to like use some of the framing stuff that I talked about in the last video to really set up a reason why evaluating the 1AC off of these net benefits that are done via content doesn't really like allow you to like ingest or like produce the type of refusal that is necessary for the for the breaking out of the form that you're kind of like setting up at the top of the debate. And I think that that can open up as a place for you to really push this, but once again, that kind of requires you to do that specific work from the uniqueness work above. I think that in the context of impact comparison, I think it's particularly important to think about how you're doing impact comparison in terms of maybe critiquing a lot of the ways that other teams will hedge their impacts against Baudrillard. I think a lot of times for other teams, it's a much more comfortable space to be in, where you can really make these kind of like try or die scenarios for the types of critiques that you're making, and really set up really pressing reasons why, if you're like really in an advantageous place with your theory of power, then it means that you should really get the weight of your impact comparison. But I think that you should really push the ways in which you can apply some of your framework arguments at the top to win why the type of representation that is being offered to justify that impact comparison is like not only wrong, but kind of like also is another link to that type of violence that you're, or the type of study that you're saying is bad, per some of the link arguments that I talked about a little bit earlier. And I think kind of like making connections between these two types of arguments is particularly important, because when you're able to think about impact comparison not as something that you really need to win on, but something that you need to critique, it maybe kind of give you a lot of reasons why like refusal or the type of alternative that you would take up with this type of criticism is good. I generally think that when like thinking about the alternative of the debate, you should really be thinking about ways that you can get to something like refusal, because I think that it's really hard to articulate these alternatives in ways that don't overcomplicate the debate from a lot of like complex theory that you're unpacking above. And so if you're not making a lot of time to do so, I think it can be really hard. And I think if you do have the, and like can make time for that because you're like efficient and you like really feel like you're moving through the things, that you kind of should have the space to do that. But I also think that you're like, if you're in a place where you're trying to figure out where you should really try to like cut your time, I think you should move towards a more kind of like refusal style with this type of critique, because I think that in general it allows you to move to many more reasons why the offense that you're winning on various portions of the flow are kind of like net benefits to your ability to win that type of refusal, and why that refusal is generative because of the way it gets rid of all of these things the 1AC is pushing as like valuable sources of representation. And with your framework arguments, you can like make the 1AC like into a standard that you kind of hold other like epistemologies or ways that we kind of propose various forms of study within the debate as a lens of critique that the judge can kind of like understand as like a model for how at least the debate should go down. And I think doing that type of framework can be really important for making this type of alternative make sense. Hopefully this video was helpful for you, and hopefully you keep tuning into the rest of them, and tune into the rest of the stuff I say about Baudrillard. Thanks.